Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. It is a Thursday morning in Chicago, February 14, 1929. The air, thick with the smell of coal smoke and frozen Lake Michigan water, carries a brutal, biting cold. On North Clark Street, in the heart of the Lincoln Park neighborhood, the city is waking up to a day meant for lovers, for secret messages and cheap boxes of chocolate. But here, at 2122 North Clark, inside the drab brick garage of the SMC Cartage Company, there is no romance. There is only business, the business of illicit whiskey. The garage is a staging ground, a depot for the North Side Gang, the bitter rivals of Al Capone's South Side outfit. It's a place of gruff men in heavy wool coats, their breath fogging in the unheated air. The raw, sweet smell of mash hangs in the space, a ghost of the product that fuels their empire. Outside, the city rumbles on, oblivious. Streetcars clang, vendors hawk their wares, and citizens hurry along the icy sidewalks, heads bowed against the wind. They are wrapped up in the mundane realities of their lives, unaware that inside this unremarkable building, a tableau of unimaginable violence is about to be set. Around 10:30, a Cadillac sedan, long, black, and official-looking, pulls to the curb. It has the heft and authority of a police vehicle. 5 men emerge. 2 are dressed in the heavy blue overcoats and caps of the Chicago Police Department. The other 3 are in civilian clothes, long coats and fedoras pulled low. They walk with purpose, not haste, their movements economical and sure. They enter the garage not with the chaos of a raid, but with the quiet confidence of men in charge. Inside, 7 men are waiting. Some are core members of the North Side Gang, lieutenants of its leader, George Bugs Moran. Others are associates, men on the periphery, a mechanic, an optometrist who gets a thrill from rubbing shoulders with gangsters. To them, the arrival of police is a problem, certainly, but a familiar one. A shakedown, a negotiation, a bribe to be paid. There is no panic. The uniformed officers are a symbol of a corrupt system they know how to navigate. The North Siders are told to line up against the north wall, to face the cold, whitewashed brick. They comply. It's part of the dance. They put their hands up. They wait for the pat-down, for the inevitable demand for cash. But the demand never comes. Instead, the 3 men in civilian clothes step forward. From beneath their coats they produce not pistols, not shakedowns, but the heavy, brutal instruments of modern warfare. 2 Thompson submachine guns, and a shotgun. The routine is broken. The dance is over. What follows is not an arrest, it is an extermination. The air explodes. The roar of the Tommy guns is a deafening, percussive force. A sound so alien and overwhelming in the enclosed space that it becomes a physical presence. It rips through the cold air, chewing through flesh and bone, stitching a horizontal line of death across the 7 men. 70 rounds of .45 caliber slugs tear into them. The shotgun blasts add their own horrific punctuation. For a moment that stretches into an eternity, the only sounds are the metallic clatter of shell casings hitting the concrete floor, and the wet, collapsing thuds of bodies giving way. Then, silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the slow drip of engine oil and something else. The men in civilian clothes lower their weapons. The 2 men in police uniforms then lead them out, hands raised in a pantomime of a routine arrest. To any onlooker, it would appear that the police had just raided a bootlegging den and were taking the perpetrators into custody. The illusion is perfect. The Cadillac pulls away from the curb, melting back into the city's traffic, leaving behind a frozen, silent tomb. The entire operation, from arrival to departure, has taken less than 7 minutes. This was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It was not a crime of passion, nor a robbery gone wrong. It was a corporate restructuring, executed with military precision. It was a message, written in blood and lead, from one king to another. Today, we are not just telling the story of a crime. We are dissecting the anatomy of a masterpiece of mob violence, an act so audacious and so chillingly efficient that it would forever change the public's perception of organized crime and force the hand of a federal government that had until then been content to let Chicago's gangsters bleed each other dry. To understand the methodical brutality of that February morning, we first have to understand the city that bred it. Chicago in the 1920s was a city of violent contradictions. It was a hub of commerce and culture, a gleaming metropolis of skyscrapers and jazz clubs, but beneath that veneer, it was a city at war with itself. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, passed in 1919, had made the manufacture, sale and transport of alcoholic beverages illegal across the United States. This was prohibition, the noble experiment. But in a hard-drinking, working-class city like Chicago, it wasn't noble, and it wasn't an experiment. It was an opportunity. Prohibition didn't stop people from drinking. It just changed where and how they did it. It created a black market of staggering proportions, an illicit industry worth tens of millions of dollars a year in Chicago alone. Speakeasies, hidden behind false storefronts and demanding secret passwords, replaced legal taverns, and the men who controlled the flow of beer and whiskey became the new titans of industry. They were not industrialists or bankers. They were gangsters. They built vast, complex organizations with breweries, distilleries, fleets of trucks, and armies of enforcers. And like any other burgeoning industry, the competition was fierce. The battle for territory was fought not in boardrooms with contracts, but in back alleys with shotguns and submachine guns. Two dominant empires rose from this chaos. On the South Side, there was the Chicago Outfit, a multi-ethnic crime syndicate that had been meticulously assembled by Johnny Torrio, and was now under the command of his ambitious and ruthless protege, a young man from Brooklyn named Alphonse Capone. Capone was a new kind of gangster. He was a businessman, a CEO of crime. He saw violence not as an end in itself, but as a tool, a necessary, if sometimes messy, aspect of market consolidation. He craved not just wealth, but respectability. He courted the press, donated to charity, and presented himself as a simple provider of a public service, a man giving the people what they wanted. He controlled the city's politicians, its police force, and its courts. His influence was so pervasive that he was often called the unofficial mayor of Chicago. Capone's primary rival was the North Side Gang. The North Siders were a different breed, predominantly of Irish and Polish descent, and they were known for their reckless bravado and savage violence. They had been led by the flamboyant and hot-headed Dion O'Banion, a man who ran a flower shop as a front and was famous for his quick temper. After O'Banion was assassinated in his own shop in 1924, gunned down by Capone's men while arranging flowers, a bloody succession war began. First, Jaime Weiss took over, a man so vengeful he was nicknamed the only man Capone feared. Weiss launched a series of brazen attacks on Capone, nearly killing him on multiple occasions. But in 1926, Weiss himself was gunned down, and leadership of the fractured North Side Gang eventually fell to George Moran. George "Bugs" Moran was, in many ways, Capone's opposite. While Capone was a strategist, Moran was a brawler. He was volatile, impulsive, and openly contemptuous of Capone's Italian heritage. frequently referring to him and his men with ethnic slurs. Moran lacked Capone's organizational genius, but he made up for it in sheer aggression. He specialized in hijacking Capone's liquor shipments, a practice that was not only profitable but deeply insulting. The rivalry between the two men was not just business, it was personal, fueled by years of betrayals, assassinations, and a deep simmering ethnic and personal hatred. By the winter of 1928, Chicago was their chessboard, and the pieces were men with guns. Capone, now at the height of his power, decided it was time to remove his rival from the board permanently. The game needed a final move. The plan that would culminate in the massacre was a model of cunning and deception, born from the mind of a criminal organization that valued intelligence as much as firepower. The objective was simple: eliminate Bugs Moran and the core of his command structure in a single decisive blow. But achieving this required more than just brute force. It required a trap, one that Moran would walk into willingly, suspecting nothing. The bait, as it so often was in their world, was whiskey. Capone's organization allegedly got word to Moran, through a duplicitous associate, that a shipment of high-quality Canadian whiskey was available for a bargain price. The deal was supposedly coming from Detroit's Purple Gang, a notoriously violent Jewish gang with whom Moran had a working relationship. The story was plausible. The price was too good to pass up. The delivery point was set for 10:30 a.m. on February 14th at the North Side Gang's own garage on Clark Street. Moran was essentially being invited to his own execution, and the invitation was disguised as a business opportunity. The true genius of the plan, however, lay in its disguise. A simple ambush could lead to a gunfight, and Moran's men were notoriously tough. The key was to neutralize them without a struggle. The solution was the uniform of the Chicago Police Department. In a city where police corruption was rampant, a raid was a common occurrence. It was a shakedown, an inconvenience, but not a death sentence. By dressing their hitmen as police officers, Capone's men could ensure their targets would be compliant. They would surrender their weapons. They would follow orders. They would line up against the wall without a fight, assuming the worst they faced was a night in jail and a hefty bribe to pay. The logistics were meticulously arranged. A Cadillac, identical to those used by high-ranking police detectives, was acquired and fitted with a police bell and a gun rack. The police uniforms were procured, and the hit team was assembled. Capone, ever the cautious CEO, would be nowhere near Chicago. He had established a very public, very conspicuous alibi. He was at his lavish estate on Palm Island, Florida, visibly suffering from a cold. He even arranged to be seen meeting with the local district attorney at the time of the killings. Plausible deniability was paramount. The identities of the gunmen have been the subject of debate for decades, as no one was ever convicted for the murders. However, law enforcement and historians have pieced together a credible list of suspects. The shooters were believed to be a mix of Capone's own trusted enforcers and outside talent, hired to make tracing the hit back to the outfit more difficult. The most prominent names were Albert Anselmi and John Scalise, two of Capone's most feared Sicilian triggermen. Another was Machine Gun Jack McGurn, Capone's top lieutenant, and the man widely credited with orchestrating the entire operation. It's also strongly believed that members of the Egan's Rats gang from St. Louis were brought in as freelance muscle, men like Fred Killer Burke, whose connection to the crime would be cemented years later through a remarkable forensic discovery. One crucial detail of the plan hinged on a case of mistaken identity. Moran was the primary target, and the signal for the attack to begin was his arrival at the garage. On that cold Valentine's morning, Albert Weinshank, one of Moran's lieutenants, arrived at the garage. Weinshank was of a similar height and build to Moran, and he was wearing a similar hat and overcoat. The lookout for the hit team, posted across the street, saw Weinshank go inside and mistakenly identified him as Moran. The signal was given. The Cadillac rolled up. The trap was sprung. But where was Bugs Moran? By a sheer twist of fate, he was running late. As he and two of his associates approached the garage, they saw the police car parked outside. Believing it was a genuine raid, they did what any sensible gangster would do. They turned around and walked away, heading to a nearby coffee shop to wait it out. That simple act of being 5 minutes behind schedule saved his life. He was the one man Capone wanted dead, and he had slipped through the net, completely by chance. Inside the garage, the execution proceeded as planned, with his men dying in his place. The first police officers to arrive on the scene, the real police, were patrolmen from the 36th District. They were responding to frantic calls from neighbors who had heard the sustained, terrifying clatter of machine gun fire. What they found inside 2122 North Clark Street was a scene of such singular horror that it defied description. The garage was cold and quiet. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. 7 men lay in a tangled heap along the north wall. Their bodies were riddled with bullets, their expensive suits and coats soaked in a grotesque mosaic of red. The whitewashed brick behind them was pockmarked and scarred, a brutal testament to the firepower that had been unleashed. The scene was a study in contradictions. The sheer number of shell casings, 70 of them from Thompson submachine guns plus shotgun shells, spoke of overwhelming chaotic violence, yet the scene itself was eerily orderly. The victims were all in one place. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned tables or chairs, no evidence of a gun battle. It was clean, it was clinical, it was an execution. Initial confusion reigned. The first officer on scene, Sergeant Thomas Loftus, famously saw one man still clinging to life and leaned in close. This was Frank Gusenberg, a tough-as-nails enforcer for Moran's gang. He had been shot 14 times. Loftus asked him who did it. Gusenberg, adhering to the gangster's code of silence, the omerta, even in the face of death, reportedly whispered, "Nobody shot me." He would die 3 hours later at a local hospital, never identifying his killers. His loyalty, even in his final moments, was a stark illustration of the closed world the police were trying to penetrate. The victims were soon identified. They were a cross-section of Moran's operation. There were the enforcers, Frank and Peter Gusenberg, brothers and feared gunmen. There were the administrators, Adam Heyer, the gang's bookkeeper and business manager, and Albert Koschelik, another top lieutenant. And there was Albert Weinshank, the man whose resemblance to Bugs Moran had triggered the massacre and cost him his life. But 2 of the victims stood out, highlighting the often indiscriminate nature of this world. John May was a mechanic, not a gangster, who simply rented space in the garage and worked on the gang's trucks. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Even more tragically, there was Dr. Reinhard Schwimmer. Schwimmer was an optometrist, not a criminal. He was a gangster groupie, a man who found the dangerous world of the North Siders glamorous and exciting. He liked to hang around the garage, living vicariously through the exploits of real-life mobsters. His hobby cost him his life. The public reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Chicago was no stranger to gangland violence. Drive-by shootings and assassinations were a regular feature of the city's newspapers. But this was different. This wasn't a shootout between rivals in a dark alley. This was a mass execution, carried out with chilling precision in broad daylight. The use of police uniforms was a particularly terrifying detail. It shattered the already fragile trust between the public and law enforcement. If you couldn't tell the cops from the killers, who could you trust? The sheer scale and savagery of the crime shocked the nation. Newspapers dubbed it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, a name that captured the horrifying irony of the event. The photos of the blood-stained wall and the row of bodies were published across the country, bringing the reality of organized crime into American living rooms. The public, which had often romanticized bootleggers like Capone as rebellious folk heroes, was suddenly confronted with the brutal reality of their business. The massacre became a turning point. The outcry was so immense that it forced politicians and law enforcement to act. President Herbert Hoover, who had just taken office, reportedly declared the situation in Chicago a national disgrace and demanded that Capone be brought to justice. The era of tacitly tolerating organized crime was over. The federal government was about to declare war, and Al Capone was now public enemy number one. The investigation into the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was one of the most high-profile and frustrating cases in American history. The Chicago Police Department, whose reputation was in tatters, was under immense pressure to find the killers. The problem was they were faced with a near-perfect crime. There were no surviving eyewitnesses from inside the garage. The killers had worn disguises and left behind no fingerprints, and the criminal underworld operated under a strict code of silence. No one was talking. Bugs Moran, the man who had lost his entire inner circle, was publicly vowing revenge, famously declaring, "Only Capone kills like that." But to the police, he offered no concrete information. The initial investigation was a series of dead ends. Al Capone had his airtight alibi in Florida. When questioned by prosecutors there, he feigned shock and sadness, claiming he was a legitimate businessman who was being unfairly targeted. "I'm just a guest in Florida," he told them, "and I don't want to embarrass my hosts by being charged with a crime I had nothing to do with." He was a masterful performer. His top lieutenants, like Jack McGurn, also had alibis. McGurn claimed he was with his girlfriend, Louise Rolfe, in a hotel room all day. She would later be dubbed the Blonde Alibi. With traditional investigative methods failing, the case would become a landmark moment for a fledgling field of science, forensic ballistics. Up to this point, linking a bullet to a specific gun was considered an imprecise and often unreliable practice. But a quiet, unassuming man named Dr. Calvin Goddard was about to change that. Goddard was a physician and a former Army officer who had pioneered the use of the comparison microscope to examine firearms evidence. He believed that the microscopic striations, the tiny scratches and grooves left on a bullet and a cartridge case as they are fired, were as unique as a fingerprint. He could, he claimed, definitively match a bullet to the gun that fired it. This was a revolutionary idea, and the Chicago coroner, Herman Bundesen, decided to give it a shot. He invited Goddard to set up a forensic lab, one of the first of its kind in the country, to analyze the evidence from the massacre. Goddard and his team meticulously collected the dozens of bullets and shell casings from the garage floor. They determined that the killers had used 2.45 caliber Thompson submachine guns, a .45 caliber pistol, and a 12-gauge shotgun. The bulk of the killing was done by the Thompsons. Now they had the fingerprints of the murder weapons. All they needed were the guns themselves. For nearly a year, the search was fruitless. The weapons seemed to have vanished. But in December of 1929, a breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A police officer in St. Joseph, Michigan, was involved in a minor traffic accident with a man named Fred Dane. A routine check revealed Dane was actually Fred "Killer" Burke, a notorious gunman and a known associate of the Capone gang. When police searched Burke's bungalow, they found a veritable arsenal, including 2 Thompson submachine guns. The Chicago authorities were notified. The 2 Tommy guns were carefully packaged and sent to Calvin Goddard's lab. This was the moment of truth for his new science. Goddard test-fired the weapons into a bale of cotton and then placed the test bullets and casings under his comparison microscope. Alongside the casings recovered from the Clark Street garage, the images in the 2 eyepieces swam into focus. The tiny, unique lines on the test casings matched the ones from the crime scene perfectly. It was an undeniable link. These were the guns that had been used in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Goddard's work was a monumental achievement. It was the first time in American history that forensic ballistics had been used to definitively link weapons to a major crime. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Fred "Killer" Burke was one of the shooters. It also lent enormous credibility to the theory that Capone had outsourced the hit to Burke and his associates from the Egan's Rats gang in St. Louis, a classic mob tactic to muddy the investigative waters. Burke would eventually be convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but for the murder of a police officer in a separate incident, not for the massacre. The evidence linking him to the Chicago killings was strong, but prosecutors felt the Michigan case was more straightforward. The other primary suspects, Capone's men John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, would never see a courtroom for the massacre. Their end came a few months after the killings in May of 1929. According to mob legend, Capone had learned that his 2 trusted hitmen were plotting to betray him. He invited them to a lavish banquet in their honor. After a night of fine food and wine, Capone allegedly stood up, praised their service, and then, with his associates holding them down, he took a baseball bat and personally beat both men to death. Their bodies were found dumped on a roadside in Indiana. It was a brutal message about loyalty, far more terrifying than any prison sentence. Even with the ballistics evidence and the deaths of key suspects, the central figure remained untouched. There was no physical evidence, no witness testimony that could directly connect Al Capone to the order to kill Moran's men. He was insulated by layers of deniability. The massacre had made him the most famous and feared criminal in America, but it also made him the biggest target for law enforcement. If they couldn't get him for murder, they would find another way. The federal government's new war on Capone was spearheaded by 2 very different men employing 2 very different strategies. The first was Eliot Ness, a young, incorruptible agent from the Treasury Department's Bureau of Prohibition. Ness was tasked with disrupting Capone's bootlegging operations. He hand-picked a small team of agents, chosen for their bravery and honesty, who became known as the Untouchables because they couldn't be bribed. Ness and his team conducted a series of high-profile raids on Capone's breweries and warehouses, smashing equipment and confiscating trucks. Their actions cost Capone money and prestige, chipping away at his image of invincibility. But while Ness's raids were a public relations nightmare for the outfit, they were never going to be enough to bring down the kingpin himself. The real threat to Capone came from a much quieter, more methodical corner of the government, the Internal Revenue Service. A special agent named Frank Wilson was tasked with a different kind of investigation. He wasn't interested in guns or whiskey. He was interested in ledgers and receipts. Wilson's job was to prove that Al Capone, a man who lived a life of extravagant luxury, with his armored Cadillacs, silk suits, and diamond jewelry, had never filed a federal income tax return. The challenge was immense. Capone conducted all his business in cash. He owned nothing in his own name. His name wasn't on any bank accounts or property deeds. For 2 years, Frank Wilson and his team painstakingly sifted through a mountain of financial records, tracking the flow of dirty money through a labyrinth of front businesses and intermediaries. They were looking for a single document, a single piece of evidence that would link the vast income of the Chicago outfit directly to Al Capone. They found their smoking gun in a series of ledgers seized from one of Capone's gambling dens. The ledgers detailed the casino's profits, and in them, an accountant had made a notation. Al's. It was a small crack, but it was the opening they needed. Slowly, methodically, Wilson's team built their case. They found a cashier's check with Capone's endorsement. They flipped accountants and bookkeepers, pressuring them to testify against their boss. They pieced together a clear picture of a man with a massive income and no record of ever paying taxes on it. In 1931, the federal government finally indicted Al Capone, not for murder, not for bootlegging, but on 22 counts of tax evasion. Capone was dismissive of the charges. He believed his lawyers could arrange a plea deal, as they had so many times before. He agreed to plead guilty in exchange for a short sentence of 2.5 years. But at the hearing, the judge, James H. Wilkerson, stunned the courtroom by announcing he was not bound by any deals. He would not allow the nation's most notorious criminal to bargain his way out of justice. The deal was off. A full trial would proceed. The trial was a sensation. Capone's defense was that he had no taxable income, that he was merely a gambler, and that any money he received was a gift. But the prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson, presented Wilson's overwhelming evidence. They showed the jury Capone's lavish spending, the testimony of his own bookkeepers, and the ledgers that detailed the millions of dollars flowing into his pockets. On October 17, 1931, after just a few hours of deliberation, the jury found Al Capone guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. Judge Wilkerson sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever handed down for tax evasion at the time. Capone was sent first to a federal penitentiary in Atlanta, and then, in 1934, he was transferred to the newly opened maximum security prison on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. The man who had once ruled Chicago was now just a number, prisoner AZ-85. His empire crumbled without him. Prohibition was repealed in 1933, and the vast profits from bootlegging dried up. The Chicago outfit continued under new leadership, but the era of the celebrity gangster king was over. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre had been Capone's greatest triumph, the moment he had decisively crushed his rivals. But it was also the beginning of his end. The public revulsion it caused brought a level of federal scrutiny that not even he could withstand. And what of Bugs Moran? He had survived, but his power was broken. He lost his best men and his nerve. He faded from prominence, his gang collapsing without its core leadership. He was eventually arrested for a petty bank robbery and died in Leavenworth Prison in 1957, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. He had won the war by surviving, but he had lost everything in the process. He spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, a ghost haunted by the ghosts of his friends. No one was ever charged, let alone convicted, for the 7 murders committed on that cold Valentine's Day. The crime remains officially unsolved. The case file is a monument to a perfect crime, a testament to the power of a criminal organization to commit mass murder and walk away clean. The shooters, the planners, the lookouts, they all faded back into the underworld, most meeting violent ends of their own, their secrets dying with them. The massacre became a dark legend, a piece of American folklore. So we return to our central theme, the anatomy of this mob hit. What made it so unique, so definitive? It was, first and foremost, a masterpiece of planning and psychological warfare. The use of the fake whiskey deal exploited the greed inherent in the bootlegging business. The use of police uniforms exploited the ingrained corruption of the city, turning a symbol of authority into a tool of assassination. It was a plan that understood its targets perfectly, predicting their reactions and using their own expectations against them. It was a trap that they not only walked into, but helped to set for themselves. The anatomy of the hit also reveals a cold corporate mentality. This wasn't a chaotic brawl. It was a strategic elimination of business rivals. The hit team operated with the detached efficiency of a special forces unit. They went in, neutralized the targets, created a seamless illusion for their exit, and vanished. There was no passion, no rage. There was only the brutal calculus of power. In the world that Al Capone built, murder was a line item in the budget, a tool for market dominance. The massacre was the ultimate expression of that philosophy. Furthermore, the aftermath of the massacre provided the anatomy of a new era in law enforcement. It forced local and federal agencies to confront the reality that organized crime was not a local problem, but a national one. It spurred the development of new forensic techniques, like Calvin Goddard's ballistics work, which are now standard practice, and it taught the government a crucial lesson. If you cannot convict a man for the crimes everyone knows he committed, you find the crime you can prove. The pursuit of Capone for tax evasion became the blueprint for dismantling criminal organizations for decades to come, attacking their financial structures when their violent acts were too well insulated. The garage at 2122 North Clark Street was torn down in 1967, but its north wall, the pockmarked brick that had been the last thing 7 men ever saw, was not destroyed. The bricks were saved, purchased by an entrepreneur, and have since been displayed in various museums and attractions. A macabre tourist curiosity. They are a tangible link to that day, silent witnesses to a crime that defined an era. Each chip and bullet hole is a scar left by a meticulously planned act of violence, a reminder that the most terrifying crimes are not those born of chaotic rage, but of cold, calculated, and corporate-minded precision. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.